Hello, I hope you're all well. My name is Avril Hepner. I'm from the BDA in Scotland. And today, this edition of BSL Blethers will be looking at deafhood, deaf education, and deaf teachers. The sign for deafhood is this, deafhood, and we're looking at it particularly in relation to deaf education and teachers of the deaf and deaf teachers. So many of you at home will already know who our guest for this evening will be, since we are talking about deafhood. We are, of course, talking to the esteemed academic Paddy Ladd, who brought us the notion of deafhood. He'll be joining us today to pick through his ideas and the books that he's written, and particularly to talk to us about these two areas of deaf education and deaf teachers. I'd like to introduce you now to Paddy. Hello there, Paddy.
Hello, lovely to see you, and hello to everybody in the audience. Thank you very much for joining us this evening.
Well, we are delighted that you have joined us this evening. We're really looking forward to this topic tonight. We've got a number of questions, but can I first ask you to just briefly introduce yourself for those in our audience who haven't perhaps read your books and who haven't come across you before?
So I was born deaf, but I grew up within a mainstream educational environment and then joined the deaf community late. Learnt sign language when I was 22. So really late considering my age. And the reason for that is because I was mainstreamed, and I was one of the early mainstreamers. Now, of course, most kids are mainstreamed. Joining the deaf community really saved my life. It was just a joyous moment for me to meet so many deaf people, to be involved in deaf people who are more kind of militant or radical, to engage with deaf children, to campaign for deaf television, and be involved in quite a lot of, social movements within the deaf community back in the day. And then I was really piqued by the question, what is deaf culture? People talk about deaf culture in the UK, but I was like, what does that mean? So that was my first book. I went to the University of Bristol in England. There was a Centre for Deaf Studies there, and I set up courses there, and I worked for many years in the university until the university kind of put undue pressure on us and then closed the centre. And yeah, and then I've been writing books ever since and involved in that kind of activity.
Well, what a fantastic journey from there till now. And obviously your books, we're going to talk about that. But today we're going to focus mostly on your work, two of your books. The first one, we have an image of the book in question.
Ta-da!
There you have it. It's quite the tome, isn't it?
Quite thick, quite weighty.
And how long did it take for you to write that first book, roughly?
That's a good question. So about 11 years all told.
Wow. And was that off and on, or 11 years full time?
Well, I started doing some research in deaf culture for my PhD, which I was undertaking at Bristol University at the time.
I see.
And so I collected lots of data, lots of evidence about what deaf culture meant, asking older deaf people what they thought their deaf experience was, what their experiences were in deaf schools, in deaf clubs, to try and find out what do we mean by culture, to really when we think about back in that time, we talked about the transmission of stuff between the deaf people to deaf people. And the main two pillars seem to be deaf schools and deaf clubs as kind of the sites for transmission of deaf ways of being. But I had really wonderful stories and anecdotes and information from deaf people from the community.
Oh, that's lovely. And they went into your first book, and now here's your second.
And here it is.
There you have it. And how thick is that one? Oh, still a bit of a tome.
I think it's more weighty.
And how long did it take you to write that book?
So the second book, 17 years.
Oh my, from 11 and
I
17.
know.
Oh, wow, wow.
It's because I'm a very silly boy. I started writing the second book, but really, I was thinking there would be a series of 4 books. So this is the first book of a series of 4, I hope.
So there are more coming? Will it take another 17
I
years?
mean, I'll have to be very strict with
No.
myself. But the next one, I think, will come quicker. I was
Oh,
writing the 4 at the same time, which is why it kind of took so long, I think, trying to
oh, I
organize
see,
the
and
material.
you're moving between each one. Okay, wow.
Yeah, hopping
Wow.
between each
So
volume.
you've shown us your 2 books, and let's now focus on that first one, which really introduces the concept of deafhood.
Mhm.
And before we get on to talking about deafhood in greater depth, could you give us a brief kind of potted summary for our audience of what deafhood is? I'm sure they've come across the term because a lot of people have been talking about it, but could you give us a brief definition, and it may come up in questions later, and audience, you're welcome to pose those questions. But Paddy, could you tell us your version?
Yeah, sure, of course. So we've had the term deafness for many years, and I think some of us felt really that was just very audiological, very medical, very ear-centric or phonocentric, and we wanted to challenge that idea. But the question was, how can you do that? And so the reason why I came up with the idea of deafhood was to kind of challenge the notion of deafness.
Right.
So what do I mean by deafhood? What are we saying deafhood is? So we know we have deaf education, we have deaf history, we have deaf psychology, deaf theatre, all of these deaf things,
Yeah.
which all seem to be boxed separately historically. And I wanted to bring them into kind of one place, one central concept. And I think they fit nicely within this central concept of deafhood.
Okay.
And that's a really good basis from which we see these different elements of deafhood emerging: deaf education, deaf theatre, deaf psychology, etc.
Okay, so just to check that I've got that right, deafhood is a kind of it's a move away from the ear, and it's a focus more on the core of deaf being, really, and it might manifest in all kinds of different ways. Is that, have I got it right?
Yeah. So we're using the term deafhood as a position against to reject the idea of deafness and the idea of just focusing on ears. I'm thinking about we're a BSL using deaf community, and we know that that sign in BSL, which kind of means almost like your intuition or your gut feeling
Yeah,
or
something gut.
that
Yeah.
kind of innate knowledge.
Lovely. That's a beautiful, clear explanation, and I hope that's really helpful to the audience watching us this evening. So that kind of innate sense of deafness, deafhood. Um, but now I want to ask you, why do you think deafhood is such a crucial concept? Why do you think it's important?
I think there are many reasons. I suppose when we're trying to think about this kind of deaf center, this deaf centeredness, this is about really trying to recenter on what we value and what something means when we say it's ours. What do we mean by our history, our community, our culture? And then it's also about having some kind of sense of pride or confidence in ourness, our deafness, our deafhood. When I've traveled and talked to people, it's really about a way of framing how we see ourselves and being more confident, building self-esteem, and
Okay.
realizing this is who we are. This is who we are as deaf peoples. And it's really challenging kind of external oppression and external views and otherness or othering us. It's
Yeah.
about who we are and gaining that kind of self-confidence and seeing that as deaf peoples, we have this shared deafhood.
Uh-huh.
Deafhood tries to be very open-minded in relation to hearing people.
Right.
Obviously, we've often grown up maybe punished by hearing people. Sometimes that's parents, sometimes that's at school, sometimes that's in other places where there are negative notions of deaf peoples or your deafhood. And so we want to be positive around deafhood, and we understand that there are hearing people who are allies, and then they can work with us to challenge the
Yes.
kind of general society. So it is an open concept. It's not against hearing people.
Okay, so it's important because if I, for example, find my deafhood, that's going to help me grow in confidence, to resist, to feel pride in myself. And without that, I might struggle, I might be lost in uncertainty, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. When I've travelled and done workshops and taught people and engaged in conversations, I've often said, what makes you feel most proud or confident about yourself? Often people say deaf history.
Yeah.
Deaf history is very important in that innate sense of deafhood and deaf being. That's the thing that we've kind of enabled us to kind of lobby over the years to allow sign language to be used. That's something that we have like this internalized value because there's a history to that language use, not wanting to give it up.
Yeah, yeah.
Often deaf people don't have any access to their own history. They're not taught it in schools. It's not talked
Absolutely.
about. So then suddenly, when you get that exposure to deaf history, it's amazing. From 1760 through to the 1800s, 120 years through to 1880, we saw lots of positive discourses around being deaf, passing on our histories, talking about the shoulders on whom we stand, people realizing, wow, and people being very emotional, having emotional responses to thinking, wow, I can be confident in the fact that people have gone before me and been like me.
So really the first, really the best thing for deafhood would be, is history the first step, I think is what I'm asking. Where do you start?
I mean, I would say yes, although probably that's part of a multidisciplinary approach almost, as it were. If you have deaf schools which are established by deaf people and run by deaf people, we know that we have 24 deaf schools, for example, in the United States.
Yeah.
That were set up and paid for by deaf people, fundraised by deaf people, run by deaf people. And I was like, wow, that's amazing. And people are like, oh, I didn't know that. And so if people suddenly know that that's happened before, they realize they can do it again.
It's like a role model. You look at it and believe you can do it.
Exactly. It's like, wow, yeah. And often history gives people access to the fact that they can do stuff.
So do you think that part of deafhood, an important part of deafhood, is kind of engaging with those values and that history that we've seen, and that can help us move forward, really? And I wanted to kind of ask, when we think about now as opposed to times gone by, and I think about young deaf people who might be lost, unsure of their identities. Deafhood is a way of kind of empowering them, helping them move forward, you think?
I think it's much more important now because many more deaf children are mainstreamed. So, I mean, your time, our time, my time anyway. In my
My time too.
time,
Yeah.
deaf schools were still in existence. So you still had sports competitions. You could go and meet other deaf kids from other deaf schools. So you had networks which evolved through education. So even though people suffered through oralism, there was still a sense of being able to come together, and there was kind of national networks.
Yeah. Yeah.
So people were familiar with other deaf people and knew, whilst they maybe the system might oppress them, they kind of knew being deaf was okay.
We were all together. Yeah.
And obviously, the less sure you are as a deaf person, the less confident you are. So coming together, you're okay. The sports competitions gave you other role models. And then you also had, people would go to deaf clubs, or you go from the deaf club in a coach. Everybody would have a chit chat in the coach.
You were connected. Yeah.
Yeah. Whereas now, if you're isolated, you don't know history, you don't know deaf clubs exist, you don't know anything about deaf culture. So that soul is lost, that passing on, those informal networks don't exist. So it's more important now than ever.
So with your book and your concept of deafhood, that's really relevant to young people today because it's a kind of gift to them almost. It's a way of passing on and maintaining that identity and some of the richness of that. You're kind of passing the baton to future generations, right?
Yeah. So then the question, if I think about in my case, who passed the baton on to me? If you think about it, who passed the baton on to you? Whilst we were in situations where we weren't supposed to sign, we were punished using sign language. There were the brave few who kind of challenged the notion of oralism. You know, there were the deaf kids who went to the toilet, well known, who then stand there in the toilet. Somebody would stand by the door with their elbow on the door. Everybody would sign, and then as soon as somebody felt pressure on the door, they'd stop signing so they weren't caught using sign language. And when the teacher was gone again, whoever it was, then they'd start to sign. Or in the dormitories, when the moon came up, so there was enough light, stories could be told because you could open the curtains and the moonlight was enough to tell those stories. Those are brave people from our histories who have kept our culture alive.
Staying on the theme of deafhood, though, I'm just thinking about, you know, we're talking about passing the baton on and all of that, but coming back to deafhood, those people who are kind of born into sign language environments, you know, are they born with deafhood? Is it already there?
Yeah, I actually have a diagram of 5 kind of concentric circles, as it were, showing different levels of deafhood, emancipation, really.
Okay.
It could be for somebody who's hard of hearing, as well as somebody who's deaf could have some sense of deafhood. If we think historically, hard of hearing and deaf people were taught together. It's only in modern times suddenly they've been siphoned off. And it's also then a way of kind of creating division and people maybe looking down on other people because of this divisiveness and creating infighting. Whereas historically that wasn't the case.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Really, you have to think about who's doing the oppression, not fight against each other. Really, it's mainstream society or figures, you know, hearing people who are oppressing.
Okay.
So why shouldn't we work together and respect each other?
Okay, Paddy, before we go on with this, I'm just going to have a look at a graphic. Actually, just before we go on, we've got a comment from Abby. So let's see the comment from Abby. Abby says, that's pretty interesting information. Deaf history is pretty important for deaf culture and identity. So just a validation for you there.
Absolutely. I mean, I think I prefer teaching the idea of deafhood through a weekend course where people, you know, are in the same place. You can discuss things through the weekend. You have much more time to go through these things in greater depth. And then I'm able to really show examples from deaf history, examples where through the oralist period, but also other examples before that. In Turkey, during the Ottoman period, there was the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire at one time.
Okay.
He would in one area of his palace, it was silent, nobody was allowed to speak, so people use sign language. We have photographs showing people using sign language. It's a high status language.
That's interesting.
And people often people can't believe that sign language would have a higher status than speech. And it was felt that speech was kind of ugly, and in this serene place, sign language is better. And they used to try and find deaf people throughout the whole of the empire and bring them into the palace so that there was this generational passing down of sign language. Most people never know this. This information isn't available. But when you know it, it's kind of inspiring.
That's great. Well, we've got someone else who wants to compliment your work. Anne, we have a comment from Anne.
Thank you so much, Anne.
Inspirational, Paddy.
I really appreciate it.
That's great.
It's important for me when I'm at home typing and working on a book, which can be very disheartening. Sometimes I think, oh, I've had enough. I want to quit. And these kinds of comments really help me carry on. So thank you very much.
Well, refreshing. Ready for your next book, perhaps, Paddy? Give you the energy to get back to that keyboard and carry on with the next one.
Absolutely. It's very important.
Okay. I just want to encourage our audience again. If you want to ask any questions, do send them in. But I distracted you, Paddy. We were talking about those 5 levels of deafhood, and we've actually got a graphic of that. It might be worth seeing that before you go on with the explanation. So let's have a look at that graphic, if we may. Okay. So we've seen that. Obviously, there are the 5 levels there of deafhood, but talk us through it, Paddy. Talk the audience through it.
I mean, it's complicated, so good luck, everybody. I'll try and summarize it, and I hope it's understandable.
Lovely. Level 1.
And at that time, we were really at that time when I was thinking about my research, I was thinking about the journey you experience, your Deafhood journey, from the cradle to the grave. And really thinking about how we can help ourselves reflect upon where we are in this journey,
Okay, so
how we're
reflection.
navigating through this journey, and also how we can maybe develop ourselves
Right.
to have more deafhood, as it were. So deafhood is a very flexible concept in some ways, and
Okay.
your deafhood journey is something you experience through life, and it's not going to be the same. Some people could have deaf parents, some people could be from rich or poor backgrounds, some people, their ethnicity, being black or white, could be really important. So all of these things are part of our experience, but we still see that there are some points where they seem to arrive and have to navigate through, as it were. So we say that there are 5 stages, but I think of it more as a circle. So this kind of like core of your being, this smaller notion of deafhood, and gradually expanding your deafhood, your deaf being.
Okay,
And
so
that
what
can
are
be
the 5?
something, say, they're kind of in your gut, your in innateness, or kind of in your head or whatever. So the smallest is that you know that you're deaf. It's a medical thing. You know that maybe you're hearing impaired, maybe you think you're hard of hearing, but it's really about that kind of medical notion. You have the experience of not being able to hear.
What's the second level?
So secondly is that you know that you're deaf, but you are you cower to the hearing world, as it were. You kowtow to them, you make sure you give them power. So if we think historically, we had the missioners in deaf clubs who ran the deaf clubs. They were typically hearing, and you would think about that almost in a welfare model of being helped. And you use the sign hearing, if you remember it, which is like the thumb for good. Oh,
Yeah.
so, the people who are better than me. So even though you had a sense of your kind of deaf identity and deaf self, you still thought of yourself as a second-class citizen and dependent
Dependent.
upon hearing
Yeah.
people.
Yeah. So what's the third level then?
And the third level is when you start to break out from that mentality, and you know that from on a human rights level, you're like, I have a right. You're a little bit more.
Standing up a little bit. You're standing up
Not
for yourself.
fully resilient, yeah.
Yeah.
So you're wanting access to things. You might be involved in protests and activism. So you're kind of more assertive. But there are still 2 more levels of emancipation, almost, as it were. And some people don't progress through those, I would say. The 4th level is,
Okay, what's the
I'm
4th?
deaf. I'm a sign language user. I belong to the deaf community. BSL is my language, wanting recognition of BSL, wanting deaf schools and engaging in bilingualism. And so you have a much stronger sense of deafhood and deaf self. And that's great, but still there's a further level, as it were.
And then what's that, the 5th one?
Yeah, to be fully kind of free is that you have a notion of deaf history, deaf culture, deaf art, deaf arts, deaf spirituality, some sense of why you're here. God didn't make me ill or whatever, but God put me on this earth as a deaf being to be deaf.
So
You're
really strong in
maximally,
this space.
exactly, maximally engaging in your kind of deaf being. So I suppose that's the kind of strongest deafhood.
Okay, so those 5 levels, I see what you mean. It starts with this central core and it expands, it gets stronger and stronger, and you get more and more resilient, more and more assertive as a deaf person as you go up through those layers.
And I think it helps the deaf community ask themselves, where have I arrived at? Where am I in my journey of deafhood? Am I maximally the deaf being I can be?
Okay, so a bit of reflection. Yeah.
Yeah. In kind of deaf schools, sometimes there's a little bit of snootiness. People think that they know everything, especially if they're from deaf parents. But it may be kids with deaf parents, but they still might not know deaf history. They still might not know all aspects of deaf culture. Even if deaf kids who've gone to deaf schools may not know these things, even if they don't have deaf parents. So there's still a journey to learn who you are and how you fit
There's still
into
growth. Yeah. Lovely. Okay, so that's a great description. I get this sense of deafhood, this reflection, and you've explained very clearly those 5 layers. But I have another question for you. Does that mean that each individual deaf person might arrive at different levels of that. You know, someone might be at 3, someone might be at 4, someone at 5.
And that's where really people need to, you know, this is why we need spaces for people to talk about these things, to think about, where might I be? How advanced might my deafhood flourishing be? Very few deaf people, I think, really have achieved maximal flourishing of being deafhood 5, if you want to call it that. Have an idea of deaf history, deaf culture, a rich understanding of what deaf culture is. That's not widespread within the British deaf community. I mean,
Right.
sometimes people are a little bit look down on people, and you know, the whole idea about this is not about competition and saying, oh, I've got more deafhood than you have. That's
No,
not.
it's more reflection. Yeah.
No, and that's what the mainstream community wants. They want us to divide and conquer. They want us to argue with each other.
Okay.
That's how they exert their control. They kind of encourage infighting.
Okay.
And that's really the problem that we want to avoid.
So this kind of reflection seems to be very important for deaf people, as opposed to judging others, kind of looking inward, thinking about reflecting on where you might be in that journey. Have you reached 3 or 4 or 5? It's this process of reflection that's important. Yeah.
Yeah, my dream was that we would maybe set up a deafhood discussion group where people from many different backgrounds would come together and share their experiences, share their journey. So people could just listen to their journey and be like, oh, wow, you're from a hearing family. Oh, you've had this terrible experience. Oh, I'm from a deaf family. I didn't realize you'd experienced that. So this could be a way of exchanging and discussing stuff. But I think it's just difficult. But that would be my dream, that we have discussions where we explore who we are.
That's a really lovely explanation, and I hope any members of our audience who've been confused by those 5 levels now have them clear. And I'd like to, we've got lots of questions from the audience. So I think Erin McCluskey has a question. Can we put that on screen? So the question here from Erin is, do you feel the adults who are responsible for the development of deaf children and young people, such as parents, teachers, social workers, youth workers, are doing enough to encourage their sense of deafhood? What's your response to that, Paddy?
That is a great question. And it's a complicated question because you've named 4 different groups. And each one of those groups are maybe very different. So let's take an example. If we think about parents, and really my heart bleeds for many parents. I mean, you know, I feel my first job as a social worker was to work with deaf children, and I saw, you know, hearing parents suffer because, you know, oralism and the oralist system lied to them. Doctors who are very, very clever and who obviously people respect didn't tell them the whole truth. And they really kind of like never, it's not hearing parents' fault. Or,
Right.
you know, if they've made a mistake, often it's because of the advice they've been given. Really, deaf children are our future, and we need to welcome hearing parents into our community as well. And I think that's not something we're able to do at the moment, often because of the kind of like brainwashing of oralism in the system, as it were. It's so systemically entrenched that as soon as a child's born deaf, we have audiologists, speech and language therapists, doctors, such a
Yes, quite
strong
proud.
medical,
Yeah.
such a strong medical focus, that where is the space for parents who has this newly born deaf child to think? So really, it's enough to bring you to tears. And I think we need to try and engage them into the journey, and change our attitude and welcome parents. I'm trying to think what the other groups are. Teachers. I'll talk about teachers later.
Yes, we're going to talk about that later. So yeah.
I think they're probably not doing enough. Youth workers. I mean, that is a very good point. I think it would be great if there were deafhood courses established for youth. That would be great. I know that the BDA many years ago had like school leaving courses.
Yeah.
Where those who were just leaving school could come together for a weekend and undertake courses. Maybe that should be something which is reenacted, and it could be part of that process. I can't remember who the 4th group was.
Youth workers, parents, teachers. Do you think they would all, you know, be able to take part in the same training? Could we teach them all together, or do you think they'd need to be in separate groups? Yeah.
I mean, I do think we want to teach them all. I mean, our dream maybe is for Scotland, since Scotland has the BSL Scotland Act, and that's passed, really we want to try and bring parents into the journey with us.
Well, the UK as well now, not just Scotland. We have this UK-wide, hopefully.
And the world.
Okay,
Sadly.
thanks. Thank you, Erin. So we think everyone should be involved in this work towards deafhood, not just particular groups like young people or parents, or it has to really involve a lot of people to bring deafhood to a child and make sure that they're set for life.
But it's important for us to understand that the system and the people in the system that we've described already don't want that to happen. And we haven't necessarily directly engaged with them enough to challenge that. We're still a little bit resistant and still a little bit feeling that maybe they are superior to us. But we need to maybe research up, as it were, and find out, why are you engaged in this system? What's the problem with sign language? What's wrong with bilingualism? If a child can speak, they can develop speech, but why not use sign language as well? Why shouldn't you want to give them the ability to navigate into different spaces and different worlds?
So you feel for strong deafhood, really, we need to engage with lots of people and get them all involved in this journey. Okay, thank you. We've got another question from Anne. I wonder if it's the same comment. There you go.
Yeah, hopefully, I think you've passed your exam, right? Yeah, using 10% of your income.
Using your work, which is great, so people are looking to your work, and I think that's really lovely.
But just to add to that, it seems that more and more hearing people from kind of outside of our community are becoming involved. I mean, Avril, you'll know, you've seen Rose Ayling-Ellis in Strictly Dancing has really kind of opened up some people's perspectives. And, she said deaf people haven't been allowed to sign, deaf people haven't been allowed to teach, and people are like, oh, that's terrible. So we need to bring those people who are allies into our fold as well to support us in our political fight. Could they come to us without any kind of false understandings or previous knowledge? Some of the people who are already involved in the system are kind of very entrenched in their thinking. Whereas these new people are like, oh, Rosie Ellis seems fine. Why not use sign language? They should be involved in deafhood as well. Maybe they should be involved in, as allies. Those are the people who maybe can really be actively involved in supporting our cause.
Okay.
Obviously, we have to lead, but they can definitely follow our lead. We can give them tips and understandings about how, what happens in the hearing world, how things can change, how they can maybe influence change in their area. Okay,
we've got more questions. 2 or 3 questions that are burning. We have one from Linda, has a question. It's quite long. I'm not sure if we'll be able to fit it all on screen, in fact, but let's try and see what happens, and perhaps we can pick the bones of it. Let's see. I hope everyone can see that at home. It's quite a long comment. It says, I wish we could stop using the term mainstreaming. There's nothing mainstream about deaf children attending schools that are not geared to their needs. They don't provide a sign language base. This isolates them further. It's a misrepresentation of what's happening with these hearing schools for deaf children. The hearing schools, if we describe them as hearing schools, we immediately give a visual and mental picture of what the school is about. What's your thought on that? The comments about mainstreaming. It does go on, yes, you're right, but we only have enough space for that first part of the comment.
I suppose that makes me think about how we developed the word. So looking back in the past, it was a different word. It was integration previously.
It was integration, yes.
And I'm sure Linda is familiar with that. But when you're talking about one deaf child in a hearing school, that's when, we started to pun with the sign and have that one within the many sign. But it was really kind of like to pun that word because it's one child within a hearing environment, or one deaf child out of everybody. But yeah, I mean, I suppose maybe we could think about using the sign hearing school.
Food for thought, isn't it? I mean, we don't have to have an answer. Okay, let's move on to the next one. There are more. We have a comment from Emma Ferguson Coleman. Emma says, deafhood needs to be taught as a concept to hearing professionals who work closely with deaf people, especially those of an older generation, where they may not be able to explain fully what deaf culture means to them and their deaf histories. So what do you think of that idea of hearing professionals?
I have to say, Emma, that photo of you is quite bizarre to look at. And just as an aside,
what do you think of the comment though, Paddy?
I thought you were more reserved than that, potentially. Anyway, sorry, I'm digressing. I apologize. Yes, I think we do have to make sure we teach professionals who work with deaf people. I think, it's been, 40 years now where we've been teaching deaf awareness training. And I'm not sure. I mean, I suppose we could carry on with that, but I feel like, it's maybe a little bit of an antiquated model, and maybe it's not a fully flourishing deafhood approach.
Deafhood would be better, you think?
I mean, maybe it's second or third level, as it were, a second or third phase. You have to stand in a certain place to make sure a deaf person can lip read you clearly or whatever. And that is important information, but maybe deafhood awareness would be better. I mean, I'm too old to set up a training course. I'm not going to lie and go out there and run the courses and everything. I'm tired.
No. Well, and your book is a training course. You've already done your bit, haven't you? You've raised awareness anyway with the publication of your book. So you've done your bit.
Courses would be great. I mean, in America, I know they have deafhood courses, which have proliferated.
Right.
And, Americans will pay as well. The British, often people want everything for free. So in America, people are willing to pay. And we've seen a real proliferation of deafhood on many different levels, kind of like what they would say a 101 course, like a basic course, and then kind of like a 201 course, the next level, and a 301 course, almost like level 1, level 2, level 3. So they're doing a really great job. Not so much here in the UK at the moment. We probably need somebody to take responsibility for kind of leading that charge. And if we had deafhood courses, I mean, I don't know that they could be free.
Everybody, I mean, deaf people and hearing people alike would be able to access those. Yeah, good concept. Okay, let's have a look at the questions again. What have you got there? Yes.
Well done, Scotland.
Yes, thank you. Let's move on a little at this point to talk about your second book now. There are some more questions, so let me just check that we've covered the most pertinent points. There are so many, honestly, Paddy, there are so many questions. So many questions, bear with me. It's lovely, it's great. Linda had asked about BSL GCSE. That can come up now. Linda says, I don't know what is in the BDA's response to the BSL GCSE consultation. Hope they're presenting this out to members as our representatives and so that we know what has been said on our behalf. Meantime, do you think deafhood should be part of the BSL GCSE? Over to you, Paddy.
Well, that is a good question. I mean, I'm very supportive of the idea of a GCSE for BSL, or whatever the Scottish equivalent is.
Okay.
But I feel like it's a little bit late as well. We need something for, the younger years, junior school, nursery. So I'm a little bit conflicted in some ways. It is great to have, but hopefully the establishment of BSL GCSE will enable things happening much sooner. Not baby sign. We know that that's really seems to have really been very popular, and it just seems to be a moneymaker. But could Deafhood be in a GCSE? I'm trying to think about what that would be. I'm trying to think my time when I was learning German, GCSE, what was included in that.
Can you compare?
Yeah, most of it was language stuff, but of course you include politics, deaf cultural politics, maybe deaf history should be included.
Okay.
So if you're including those within the GCSE as well, then already you're kind of including the foundational stuff of Deafhood.
Okay, more food for thought. Lovely, thank you. So another question here from Stuart Parkinson this time.
Hello,
Stuart says, since Deafhood started, Paddy, what have you noticed any changes or advancement in the well-being and promotion of sign language throughout the world? What are your hopes now?
Hello, Wales. I'm not sure the relationship between Deafhood becoming a better known concept and sign language recognition across the world. Maybe there is a relationship. Maybe that has given some communities more confidence to fight for recognition.
Yeah, some of that kind of standing up for themselves is a part of that, isn't it?
Yep, it could be. Maybe the best person to ask would be a Belgian woman from Marcia de Mulder. She's studied a variety of different sign language recognition laws and systems, and also how things have developed, why different systems have developed, why different ways of recognition have happened. But it does seem maybe these things have worked in parallel.
Yes, in parallel is what I was thinking.
From the year 2000 onwards, we've seen more talk about Deafhood, more talk about sign language recognition. I mean, it's a great question, something to ponder, I suppose. Maybe they mutually support each other. But Marcia, a Belgium academic, I think she's the person who maybe would better be able to plot the relationship. But I think it's a big question in terms of underlying what's the shift being. If we think about those 5 different stages or phases of Deafhood flourishment, the recognition of sign languages is maybe the 2nd or 3rd phase. Maybe 4th, but it's not the 5th, like maximally flourishing Deafhood. That would include, I mean, at the moment, we're focusing on, deaf access to things, recruiting more interpreters. But what about cultural protection? What about how do we protect deaf cultural phenomena? How do we promote deaf cultural activities? How do we protect deaf children?
Okay.
That's really what we're talking about. That's our dream when we're fighting for, for BSL recognition in 1998, was to protect deaf children, to try and beat oralism. Say, like, look, sign language is recognised. You have to learn sign language now. So deaf kids can have access to that. But really, the vision has diminished over time.
Yeah, okay.
So I understand it's a multi-stepped journey. But we have to realise this is a journey. We haven't reached the end point yet. We need to make sure we have that big vision. At the moment, we realise we're really just at kind of phase 3.
Yeah, just 4 or 5. Yeah.
If we're wanting, it's about group rights, and it's not just about group rights and access, but it's also about group rights for deaf schools, deaf art, deaf culture, deaf phenomena. If we think about in Scotland, the Gaelic community, Gaelic speakers have rights. It's not about individuals. That's almost like a divide and conquer mentality, which weakens phenomena. This is about group rights, and it's a much bigger concept than we're dealing with currently.
Okay, so we've got one more question then. As a question for you, Paddy, which is a kind of personal question from Erin. She says, going back to the roots, Paddy, how did you first realise there was a system to the term Deafhood? Can you explain a bit more about how the work leading up to your book about Deafhood and who inspired you?
Well, I think I swore a little bit there. I'm worried we won't have time to talk about deaf education, but
Okay, could you just pick one or two brief things to say in response to Erin, perhaps?
I mean, I understand there's pressure because of the questions we're being asked as well. But maybe if James could put up the question again, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
So how
Would
did
you
it
read
happen?
the
I was
question
studying
there?
deaf culture. And really, nobody really knew what they meant. They used the term deaf culture and they talk about, physical things like using a TTY or flashing lights, minicoms. But I was like, what about the culture of deaf people? So in university that I was teaching before, people like, what's British? You'd ask people, what's British culture? And people are, I don't know, fish and chips, football,
Yeah.
beer.
Yeah.
So I'm like, you don't understand your culture. Nobody really understands the word culture. So that was my starting point in some ways. And then I was interested in what's the difference between American and British deaf culture. And then I talked to some older deaf people to ask them what their time was, what their experience was.
And that was the start of it. Yeah.
And it seemed to have a difference between deaf culture and deafhood. That's really what hit me. Deaf culture was kind of beautiful and wonderful, but a little bit response to oppression, as it were. So really being kind of smaller or lower status, but wasn't really about a positive, flourishing idea of being deaf.
Okay, that's
And that's
lovely.
what happened.
Okay, yeah, that's great. Lovely. I'm going to stop you there. But do you want to ask? Do you want to respond to that little last bit about who inspired you?
Who inspired me? I think lots of deaf people. But for the PhD study, that research, there was a woman named Gloria Pullen.
Yeah. Yes.
And how
Lovely lady.
she explained to me being deaf was so clear. And then an American deaf woman called Marie Philip.
Yeah, Marie Philip. Yeah.
They had a very similar description of being deaf. And I was like, wow, I can see that journey now. Wise deaf women.
Lovely. Thank you. There are lots more questions, but if we're going to move on to the second book, we'll have to put those on hold. So let's do that and move on to your second book, which is about deaf teachers. Okay. So can you tell us a little bit more about this book? You talk about deaf pedagogy. What is that? Can you come on? It's another thick book, I know, but can you talk us through that a little bit?
So in some ways, it's part of deafhood theory, or how we theorize about deafhood, or how we apply deafhood into different areas.
Right.
So there could be deafhood in relation to interpreting, in relation to television and the media, in relation to theatre and arts. That's really the basis of deafhood, to think about this flourishing and how it can apply in different areas. And of course, one very important area is education.
Okay.
So for me, I felt, I will be obsessed by deaf education until I pass away. And when I'm up with the angels, I'll still be looking to see what's going on.
But it is so important to the deaf community, isn't it? It really is. So can you
Yeah,
tell us a little bit more about this book?
absolutely. So I had seen deaf teachers working whenever I'd visited deaf schools and just been so impressed by the way they engaged with students. And I think often they were teaching assistants or not fully qualified teachers, but what they did in a classroom was amazing. So, they might not have had GCSE English at the right level, so they couldn't become a qualified teacher. So that was a big barrier for that kind of generation, and still for some. And so it
Yeah.
was really amazing to witness these teachers. I went to 3 schools. I picked 2 schools which are clearly very well known as schools for the deaf, very good teaching. I was interested to see what happened there and how they engaged with the pupils. I made notes about that and then had one-to-ones with the teachers. I'm like, why were you doing this against the notes I'd made? Why are we doing this? Why are we doing that? And try and find out what their philosophy was, and kind of collected that kind of data. And really, it was amazing. The people who were describing what they were doing in the classroom was just phenomenal. And their work is largely unrecognised. They had very similar philosophies, even though they'd never met each other. They
Just
knew
thinking
how,
on the same lines.
absolutely, they knew how to modify what they're doing to meet the needs of the deaf children in their classrooms.
Okay, you're saying you visited these schools and you observed these teachers, and these are deaf teachers teaching children. But when we were chatting just before we started this live stream, you mentioned something that I want to come back on now. You said deaf classroom time. And can you talk to us a little bit about that? What is deaf classroom time? Because this is deaf children engaging with deaf teachers and that being really important. Can you talk to us a bit about that?
Maybe I'll talk about the 6 levels first of all, just briefly.
Yes, okay, do. Yes, do.
Rather than jump straight into deaf classroom time. So I collected all of this information from the conversations and observations that I'd had. And I saw that there was a deaf philosophy, a deaf way of teaching, which seemed to be very different from hearing people's ways of teaching. Very different perspective. They saw deaf children as full people.
Okay.
So I would say I use a different kind of sign, like a whole sign, but I mean like a complete human being. The teacher skills was rooted in deaf culture. How they knew how to modify what they were doing was something that had been passed on to them from other deaf people.
Yeah.
So something, maybe they came from deaf families, maybe they were from a hearing family, but they socialized heavily within the deaf community and with deaf educators. And so they also could see how somebody might fit in the deaf community in the future. They had a vision of who this deaf child could be, a holistic vision of the child.
That's really useful.
And their future.
So they could look forward.
From what they've seen in the past. And so they could educate, discipline maybe as well, somebody so that they could, learn and then pass on this knowledge almost as a cycle, especially if they saw somebody who could be a teacher, for example. Then again, there were values and traditions that needed to be passed on.
So to summarize what you're saying that a deaf teacher, because they have that experience of being deaf, they have that inheritance, they can pass it on to the children as they teach.
And so part of that, yes, is also around those deaf children realizing that they have a responsibility when they become adults to take on and then also support the deaf community. But that's also around being healthy, growing up healthily, growing up holistically, understanding how they fit into the community. And it was a beautiful cycle of passing on deaf wisdom and deaf knowledge.
Yeah.
And so there are 6 levels to that.
Okay.
But most of this is, from previous schools up until the age of 18, that this seems to be passed on in a phased way. So from deaf kids who kind of arrive in a deaf environment and don't know what's happening, having to make sure they understand how to pay attention, to really switch the lights on, start the engine, as it were. That's the first thing, is eye gaze and making sure you know how to pay attention. That really
Yeah.
And so that was the first priority. And then it's about information. To show the information, not, actually make sure that information is beautifully delivered visually, also knowing that you need tactile ways of having attention, sign language used in an incremental way and gradually in a more complex manner as the children age.
Dropped in bit by bit as you go.
Yeah. And so then suddenly also making sure that the classroom was a safe space.
A deaf space, so that feels safe. Yeah.
That's somewhere that any deaf child can come into the classroom, be themselves, say what they need to say what they're thinking, allow thoughts to be drawn out of them rather than teaching, engaging. And then the 4th level was about language, really starting to increase the language, accelerate the language exposure.
So they're really learning. Yeah.
The 5th part of teaching was about identity, understanding that you're deaf, I'm deaf. and this world is a deaf world, but when you go outside, it's a hearing world and it's different. So how you fit in with us and how you might fit in there is different. And then the sixth level is about how to behave within a deaf space and within a hearing world.
Okay.
And so really understanding how to navigate different spaces and your identity within your community and with others. So those were the 6 levels, which really, but underlying there was kind of 80 different skills which were developed to achieve those 6 levels. So if I could pick one, it's deaf time. So the deaf teacher wasn't like, had too much experience to let somebody just kind of like pretend that they understood. But a deaf teacher would understand, you haven't understood what I've said, and repeat what's being said. So no.
Yeah, that's the thing. Yeah.
Repeat it in a different way so that maybe the deaf child could understand, but they
Yes,
wouldn't be
like
allowed
the
to
other way
get away with
around.
not understanding.
Yeah,
You know.
yeah.
And that may be because it's slower through repetition, or gradually, if somebody hasn't understood it, then repeat it again to make sure all of the children in the class have understood a concept.
A variety of tools, yeah.
And then deaf time can also be a time where there's a rapid exchange of information, very smoothly exchanged. So also, because of extended peripheral vision, a deaf teacher can see if a hand has gone up and say, hold on a moment, let somebody finish. The person who knew, because the deaf person responded saying, hold on a moment, knew that they could be patient, and then said, sorry, what was your point? So that kind of interactional space, playing on kind of the peripheral vision.
Because they just fit together, don't they? So the teacher can manage well. Yeah.
Absolutely. So it's a very different, sometimes there are slow moments, sometimes there are faster moments to ensure comprehension, to allow discussion.
So this is a deaf space, there's deaf time. And so do you think, when you bring in deaf teachers to teach deaf children, they match so well with their pupils, that kind of creates good deafhood? And do you think the teacher has to have good deafhood in the first place to provide that?
That's a great question. Ooh.
They should, shouldn't they?
So I think from my research, I can think of, grassroots deaf people who were excellent, had excellent language, excellent cultural resources. And I would say, their deafhood was pretty good. If somebody maybe had grown up with a mainstream environment, sorry, Linda, if somebody like myself or whatever, then I know that I don't have those resources. Maybe, you have to learn deaf culture, you have to learn how to fit in that moment. But it could be that if you went to, I don't know, a posh deaf grammar school, maybe you're not able to engage with deaf grassroots. So that may also make it difficult to engage in a classroom.
Yeah.
Because like all kids are grassroots. It doesn't matter whether they're how they communicate. When you first go into a classroom, the kids are first learning. They're all kind of grassroots deaf people, right?
Right.
So really, you need to be able to have that kind of capacity to modulate your language to really fit into all levels within the classroom.
Okay.
I think that's powerful.
So it would be good. It would be ideal in an ideal world, looking forward, if we had deaf teachers who were very kind of firm in their own deafhood to teach the children of the future, basically, and pass that on.
Well, I suppose if I could add something to that, if we think about deaf pedagogy, and this is the sign that I'm using, which is kind of around.
And what is pedagogy?
The pedagogy is a theory of how to teach.
How to teach. Okay.
It's a philosophy of teaching.
Right.
But mostly the reason why I use this kind of peculiar way of teaching, sign as it were, is because if we think about teaching, often it's about a teacher teaching down to children. But that's not what we saw in the classroom. We saw equality within the classroom. And so
a real two-way
a mutual kind of interaction in education. So the fact that, as a deaf teacher is still equal to deaf kids. When you go into a hearing world, there may be things that they don't understand, and they acknowledge
on their level so that you can
communicate
two-way. Yeah,
absolutely. Okay. So I think that's a beautiful way of learning. You learn as equals within the classroom and exchange information. What was your story? I've forgotten your question.
We're talking about whether teachers should have strong deafhood in order to teach well.
Yeah. So if we're thinking about this pedagogy that's based on a deaf cultural model, we know that deaf culture isn't perfect because often it's a manifestation through oppression. Culture can also be racist, for example, could be sexist because of what we've learned from wider society. So this is where we see deaf pedagogy as a first step to be free from that. And I think then deafhood pedagogy is actually where we make sure that we have that kind of reflection, we remove kind of oppression, and we don't want any kind of oppression within that educational environment. And that means that we recruit broadly, we treat everybody equally within the class.
Okay.
So I think that's maybe how we have to frame it.
Okay,
deaf pedagogy is great, and we need to recognise this. And it's very clear that deaf people should run the deaf education system. Sorry, hearing people, but really, you've had 168 years, and you've made a mess of it. So I think your time is up. Just let deaf people run deaf education system. I think that is also one of my big aims. I mean, you know, we have good teachers. We have some are poor, some with money from different backgrounds, but basically we need to shift what we're seeing so that, you know, then if everybody's able to have deafhood training, maybe we can move towards deafhood pedagogy.
Great. Okay. It's already an hour. I can't believe we've been talking for an hour already. And of course, we've got lots more comments. But I just want to finally, you know, just ask if you have one last message or tip or for people who are perhaps involved in education or want to further their understanding of deafhood or are thinking to the future, anything that you'd like to leave our audience with? That's quite a tough one, is it?
Well, I mean, I suppose the audience is mixed deaf and hearing people, so I suppose there are different messages for each of those audiences.
Well, let's stick with deafhood then, or teachers.
I am kind of obsessed with deaf education. I see that deaf children seem to be suffering worse and worse in hearing schools. Thank you, Linda. I think it's just getting worse and worse. The situation really being exacerbated, and we see fewer and fewer deaf schools available, which reduces the choice that parents have. And we really need to start to be fighting against that. We need to think about the BDA can do some of the kind of like polite politic, but we also need to establish the kind of naughty group, the rebels, like the NUD of the past.
And could you talk about the NUD? Could you explain for our viewers what the NUD is?
The National Union of the Deaf.
Union of the Deaf, thank you. Yeah.
And that then later evolved into the FDP. They're both a pressure group.
Deaf people. Yeah.
Where deaf people came together and made lots of noise and expressed their dissatisfaction. But you still need the BDA to do the polite politic, to kind of plant the seeds. And it's a charity, so obviously it has very different rules to comply with. But we need to think about how we can work together to set up more kind of like direct activism and pressure groups. That's still needed.
And do what?
Well, definitely could be involved in that. You know, save deaf schools. This could be one of the campaigns. Forcing people who in kind of like a community school, which is aiming not at deaf children, highlight that, show that deaf schools shouldn't be a dumping ground. That should be the first port of call for deaf children. That should be their first placement. And actually, we can make sure that if we have lots of deaf kids in those deaf schools, lots of the problems, you know, who are the kids who are 5 years behind, who are very smart, who are then put in to deaf schools later, can't catch up that gap. So we need to avoid that happening. We need to challenge wider society and say, hearing schools aren't working. Do the numbers. You're failing deaf children. I mean, it's emotional, but you are failing them educationally and emotionally. So, you know, we need to challenge them with that and be much more directly involved in that.
Okay, thank you for that. And when you're talking about education, we're talking about something that is sensitive, that is emotional. It's a very strong and controversial subject, has been so in the deaf community for many, many years. And your book about deafhood I think is something that is fundamental to these discussions. And you would like to see more and more deaf people coming forward as teachers, and those two books work in parallel with each other, don't they? Because someone with a kind of expanded sense of deafhood might then work to that sixth level in the educational area, and really pass that deafhood on to deaf children for our future generations. It seems from our audience's responses that everyone has really, really enjoyed our conversation tonight. We've got far more comments than we could cover, but we are at the hour.
I mean, I could maybe carry on for 5 minutes if you want me to answer questions. I don't mind.
Let me just have a quick look at what we've got here. Okay, we will close the session soon, but let me just have a look at another question we have here. Again from Stuart Parkinson, about people who, would you agree that those within the deaf community have to make the effort to welcome those deaf people of any age who did not grow up within the deaf community? Autism is still around, sadly, and hence why I agree with your comments that deaf culture is not perfect. So we have to make the effort. Do we have responsibility to make the effort to welcome people into the deaf community?
Yeah, we have to. I mean, if you think that was my journey. My journey was as a late signer. I was 22 when I started using sign language. And did I feel welcome? Yes, I did. I had a lot to learn, I have to be honest. So, you know, I signed English a lot and Fingerspot a lot at that time, which was obviously seen as higher status than sign language.
James, could we get that question back on screen for Paddy? Stuart Parkinson's question. Thank you.
So I think we have to put the effort in. And I know it can be difficult. So, for example, with deaf sports, that was one way that you could enter the deaf community, through sport.
Yep.
I was involved in a deaf football team, for example. I know it can be, I mean, it's a problem if most of them speak and don't sign, because then after the match you go to the pub. When it comes to having conversations, if the people are talking and not signing, then that's quite hard to challenge. And again, that can be, you know, people who think that speech is a higher status than signing. And, you know, often for deaf people, that can be seen to be rude, right? So why aren't you putting the effort in? So that can be tricky, I think.
Okay, so you're saying we do have a responsibility, really?
And in the old days, we had the FYD, the Friends of the Young Deaf. And again, that was great because we were able to invite deaf people in who maybe were hard of hearing, who didn't have sign language, and then teach deaf history, deaf culture, Deafhood. And maybe that would be a good thing to do again. Okay. So then you go back to the football team and maybe change your mind, change your mentality a little bit. You're more accepting of deaf people who are sign language users, trying to use sign language, etc.
Okay, I think we probably now really do have to bring the session to a close because we have gone over time. Obviously, I want to thank you so much for your time, giving it so generously, answering all our questions. And obviously, the audience have been incredibly engaged with the session tonight. The audience have really enjoyed it. They've sent in so many comments and questions, too many for us. We're all looking forward to your next, however many volumes there may be, fingers crossed.
I need an advert. Hold on, little plug.
Oh, go ahead. So more books?
So these are ready. These were ready to be launched, and then COVID happened, so I put them on hold.
Right.
So there are more books. So if you look on the website, there's a website for both of those books. Deafhood Signed Songs. If you Google that, then just a quick plug.
Lovely. Well, thank you. And I hope everyone at home has enjoyed their evening this evening. I hope you've enjoyed our discussion of Deafhood, and I hope people are going to look up your books.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for this evening.
Thanks to the audience.
Thank you.